A big hello and welcome to today's virtual panel on the history of games, which is hosted by H Club London, a brilliant private members club in London, if I do say so myself. And so obviously I've got some wonderful guests with me, not with me today, but you know, scattered across the UK. So I think it might be easier if you all introduce yourselves and tell everyone a little bit about what you do.
Should I start?
Yeah.
So, hello, I'm Dave Ranyard. I run an indie studio called Ranyard and Interactive. I've been testing our game today, which is a lot of fun. It's coming out in a couple of months. Prior to that, I worked at PlayStation for 17 years. Worked on lots of different titles, from Getaway to SingStar to Wonderbook to VR Worlds. So I've made quite a lot of games in the last 20 years.
Go for it, Korina.
Oh, okay. So my name is Korina Abbot. I run a small marketing agency called Neon Hive for games, but my background is publishing video games. So I've worked at some pretty big studios, including Bethesda, Ubisoft, Square Enix, as well as some indie studios as well. So my background is kind of everything in the marketing mix. Started in community, worked my way up to marketing director level. So I've worked on a lot of stuff. I've been in the industry about 15 years. So yeah, I'm also a game collector. So I've got lots of garbage in my house. But not so garbage, depends on how you feel about it.
And I'm Johnny Chiodini. I am a journalist. I worked in video game journalism for 12 years for the likes of GameSpot and Eurogamer and ITN. And I actually moved into board game journalism late last year, so bit of a career change for me, but obviously I'm still keeping my toe in the waters of video games when I'm not talking about different thicknesses of cardboard, which is my 9 to 5 at the minute. So yeah, it's lovely to be here and to be considered in some way still at least vaguely relevant.
Always relevant. And I'm Elle Osili-Wood. I'm a presenter and journalist and video game voice actor. I recently just moved into making games. I made my first ARG, A Missing Locksmith. So yeah, venturing out into new areas. But thank you all so much for joining today. I'm really excited. We've got, I think, a really great mix of different backgrounds here to chat about the history of games. So I guess what I want to start off by asking is, what was everybody's introduction to the world of games? What was the point where, you know, you became, unfortunately, one of us? I'm going to start with you, Korina.
Oh, Gameboy Classic. So that was the first console I owned. I say owned, I shared it with my brother. So there was a lot of fighting. And it wasn't really until I was a bit older that we ended up getting Mega Drives and things. I actually got like a huge Mega Drive kind of bundle from a car boot sale with like tons of games, which turned out to be lots of extremely rare games, which is very lucky. You know, once I realized what they were. But yeah, my background is obviously right back to the classic Game Boy. And then point and click adventures on PC. So basically anything I would buy that was safe for us to play. So like the Broken Sword games, like the Monty Python games, which are questionably safe, actually. I'm not sure if they were. And then looking at like things like Theme Hospital and Theme Park and stuff like that. That was probably where I started.
Johnny, how about you?
They were part of my life from day one, strangely. My parents, like uncharacteristically coolly of them, had an Atari 2600 and a Commodore 64 before I was born. So I grew up playing those. My mum was like queen of Pac-Man in the house. Nobody could top our high scores. And then the first console I actually owned was a Super Nintendo. I co-owned it with my brother. And then video games were just a constant from there. I used to read N64 magazine as a kid, and I remember reading it. I used to write them letters all the time. And I remember reading about E3 and thinking, I want to go to that one day. And then I completely forgot about that until I was on my way to E3 for the first time as a video game journalist and went, oh yeah, I planned to do this as a child. So anyway, they've always been part of my life, basically, which explains a lot, I think.
So Dave, on to you.
So as a child, me and my brother used to go and stay with our grandparents in Grimsby, Cleethorpes, which is in the north, east, west, I can't remember now. And we'd go down to the arcades and play Space Invaders, Galaga, Galaxian. So that is quite a long time ago now, but we first got into actual playing video games in the 70s, which is a long time ago. And then in the 80s, got a ZX Spectrum, played Manic Miner, which is my favourite Spectrum game. And then quite a few others, actually, adventure games and things. And then dropped it a tiny bit, but then when I was a bit older, my brother very kindly bought me a Mega Drive, and I fell in love with Sonic the Hedgehog, which is now my all-time favourite game still. And then from there, I've just got into various different games. But those are my big moments. I think Space Invaders, Galaga, Galaxian, and then Manic Miner and Sonic.
Yeah. Sonic, of course. I mean, genuinely, Sonic, I have to say, is one of mine. So I was really lucky that I was the oldest in my family, but I grew up with lots and lots of older cousins, and they were kind of my introduction. So I had on one side of my family older cousins who thought it would be funny to show me things like Silent Hill, but in quite a hilarious way. It wasn't too abusive as it sounds, because they would kind of narrate it. So it was the black side of my family, and they were very stereotypical about it. So it would be like, oh, don't go around that corner, and stuff like that. So that made it quite an enjoyable experience, actually. And then, yeah, Sonic as well. So that was my cousins on the other side of my family. They like played a lot of Sonic, and I remember just thinking it was like the best game in the entire world. And it's so funny how the games that you played earliest, I would love to know how they hold up today, you know, because for me, I feel like I've never, and it sounds really sad, but never really had that feeling again, that same absolute awe and wonder and kind of, you know, the kind of absorption into that world. So, I mean, have any of you gone back to a game and has it lived up or not to how you felt when you first played it?
GoldenEye's a really strong one for me in that it's still so fun to play, but now when you play it, your eyes bleed because low poly. And no lighting differences, real bad texture designs. And you know, at the time it was groundbreaking. I remember looking at it and thinking, this is incredible. This looks like the movie, right? There's this like kind of nostalgia level of like glossing over and filling in the blanks of your imagination, which obviously now that we're getting more and more, you know, graphic fidelity is kind of, you're losing that a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, I've played Sonic on probably every platform it comes out on. I just keep buying the same game and playing it. There are certain advantages now that you can save, because when I first had it, you'd have to start from the beginning every single time you played it, and that was quite trying.
I mean, genuinely,
it's memory.
Telling people that now, when I try and tell younger relatives that now, they just, you know, it's as if I'm telling them about the war. They're just like, how did you make it through?
I think, to be honest, the ones that were really cornerstones of my childhood have held up quite well, because like it was all about Nintendo titles like Super Mario Brothers, which still plays and feels exactly the same now, really, when we're talking about sort of the, you know, the 2D side-scrolling ones. And then things like Mortal Kombat, like they still hold up. So they were built to be arcade fighters and things like that. So it's strange to go back to things and find that actually they're still like perfectly playable and perfectly enjoyable. It's more the recent titles that I remember being wonderful that I go back to that I find myself then disappointed by. I remember around when it first came out, Bioshock Infinite, when I played that, I thought it was phenomenal. And recently I went back to it and played the opening 2 hours and just went, this is not very good. It just doesn't hold up. It's amazing how your perception of games can change over time. And I feel like that happens a lot more with games than other media. Like I can go back and watch a film I loved as a child, and it feels as, I mean, maybe if the visual effects are poor, that sort of ages, but it's not as stark as going back and playing a game and like not having that same feeling. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else.
Gone back and played the Uncharted 2, or the Uncharted trilogy? Have you gone back and played those? Like, so my partner's not a gamer, he's a scientist. So he moved in with me and then I immediately indoctrinated him. Like he's currently like 200 hours into Skyrim right now, which I'm really proud about. And you know, the thing with him is I was like, right, you need to play these games. So I had like this big list of games like Bioshock 1, which still holds up actually. It still really, really holds up. But Uncharted 2, my God, like the slog of that game. I forgot how some of the mechanics in it are actually really, what's the word? Not basic isn't the right word, but there's a lack of polish and lack of finesse to some of the mechanics because they were so fresh, they were never done before, you know. And I think that's part of that process you're talking about, Johnny, when you go back now and you're like, oh, this doesn't feel great, because before it was completely new to you. You'd never had that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, one of the things that I find really difficult is this idea that we are going to essentially lose these games in a way that, I thought it was really interesting, Johnny, what you were saying about films, in that, we will always have these films. If there was a film that was hugely important to the film industry or was particularly beloved, in 100 years' time, technology dependent, we'll be able to go back and show that to people. And there's something now about trying to show really important games, really games that were meaningful to me or to the industry, to people, and they'll never have that experience. Uncharted, I was streaming this a little while ago, from the beginning, and everybody was like, the targeting, it's terrible, it's so, and I was like, I know, but that's not that's not how it felt at the time. And so it makes me feel a little bit sad to think, that we have this industry that's so difficult to preserve our history within. When we talk about the history of games, it's kind of at a point, where quite often that's all we can really do, because you adjust so uniquely to each generation of technology. And so if you didn't experience the one below, you'll never understand why it wasn't terrible and blocky. And, it's like I remember GTA Vice City. I remember that coming out, and I played it, and I remember saying to people, I was like, games can't get any better than this. I was like, this is as good as games are ever going to look. How could they possibly be more realistic than that now? And when I show younger siblings that now, they ask if I was blind. For them, it's like, it's Minecraft, essentially. They're just like, I guess I could make out a face in that square. So, I do feel a bit sad. I mean, I guess, are there any games that you think were particularly, say, important to the industry? Do you think there are games that were genre defining that perhaps we're not going to be able to share as effectively as time goes on?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I found very interesting that I loved was when the big music games came on, and I worked on SingStar quite a lot, actually.
I did too.
Rock Band Guitar Hero, Rock Band Guitar Hero were really. It was great to make that connection with music, and they all, sort of fell off a cliff a bit. And actually, one of the sort of things I thought of when preparing for this was last year, I took two of the children to the video game museum in Sheffield, which is my hometown, and we played Rock Band, I think it was. And what I realised was when that was around, the kids were too young to enjoy it. And actually, as we left, I bought Beatles Rock Band on eBay, and then we played it all Christmas. So, I'm slightly disappointed that was a moment for those things. That I'm sure something will come back, but it's not going to be. And that Beat Saber's here now. Maybe that's the new sort of music equivalent. But for me, that was. I think the introduction of interesting and good music into games was a big thing, and I hope that we can kind of get that mojo back.
I think the thing that really worries me about stuff sort of going away, especially genre-defining stuff, are all the multiplayer games that rely on A, servers to be up and running, and B, players to be actively in there. Like, after this, I'm going to meet up with some friends online. We're going to play Sea of Thieves. It's one of my favourite games, actually, of all time. It's certainly my favourite game at the minute. But that game only exists for as long as the servers are up and running. And if Microsoft ever decides, that's it, we're going to shutter this, that's gone forever. It's... and there's certainly, as time goes on, it's harder to show people what these games were like and to capture the zeitgeist, because these games are the people who play them in many, many ways. But when they don't even exist anymore, like Halo 2, that multiplayer sort of era was like incredibly influential for a lot of people, but those servers got turned off. So like, that's done. It's strange.
Kind of riffing off of that. So my history of games actually was mostly kind of forged within the arcade scene. So my career started because of Dance Dance Revolution, if I'm honest. So I used to co-run a website with a wonderful community for dancing games, and specifically Dance Dance Revolution. So we used to run like all the European tournaments. Before EGX got involved and Eurogamer got involved, we used to run the games room for the MCM Comic Con. This is way back when it first started. All that kind of stuff, and we had like a database of every machine in the country where it was, the location, actual location, how many plays for a pound, what the quality of the machine was like, whether there were sticky pads, all sorts of crazy stuff, like super niche, crazy niche. I loved it. But we I used to spend every Saturday in the Trocadero in London, which obviously now is getting turned into flats, which I'm devastated by. I actually, when I went to Bethesda, I could see it from my desk and seeing it change was really, really upsetting. And that kind of preservation is difficult. A lot of it relies on the community itself. So a lot of those machines from the arcades, the Trocadero, were bought up by private owners. So tons of the machines that we were tracking now are owned by the community that we used to look after. And, you know, you mentioned the Video Game Museum in Sheffield. So they're currently doing a donation drive. You should totally check it out, by the way. They need your help. But they're doing a lot of work trying to figure out this preservation of games, because it's super important. And it's a huge part of culture that's going to just disappear because of the digital age. So, you know, going through like the sadness of seeing arcades like losing their footing, I kind of worry about that for the games world as well.
Yeah, we had two great comments actually. So one from Tom D, who said that the truck shutting was a travesty, which I mean, I think we can all agree with. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely devastating.
Yeah, and then obviously Katja, who just mentioned that it's really difficult legally to make preservation efforts, which is something, you know, that we're coming up against. And you just mentioned the National Video Game Museum, and I would second that. You know, they're putting loads of work into figuring out how we can do that. So, you know, definitely do check that out. Another little plug there for them. But before things get too sad, before we're too upset about everything we've lost, let's talk about things changing in a positive way. So what would you say that you're really grateful for in terms of your gaming history personally? What are the changes you've seen, the new genres you've seen introduced, or the new technologies that you love and are so grateful to see now?
I'm going to go with save games to start with.
Yeah, good stuff.
I actually, the things I think are really, I mean, I've spent the last quite a lot of career working on games that have different inputs to normal games, so not joypad. So I've worked on scene games, AR games, VR games, and what I'm finding, I think that's really interesting, is this sort of the change from being quite complex button mashing to much more natural input, which was great with SingStar, for example. So anyone with a voice could play SingStar, which is quite an open community compared to most of the games that were on PlayStation 2 at the time. And now with things like VR and AR and touch on phone, I do find that it's making things much more accessible. And I think that's a really positive thing. A lot of people play games and don't call themselves gamers because they don't realise that, you know, I mean, Candy Crush or Sudoku on a phone is a game. But I actually think that's a really good thing to broaden that out and make it much more accessible, rather than what perhaps the old school stereotype of teenage boys like pressing complex buttons. I think that's something is very good.
I'm really happy, like you kind of segued onto something I was going to say. I'm really, really grateful that games have become so much more accessible for women. Like when I was younger, I was the odd one out in my friend group because I was the only one who was interested in video games. And actually, it wasn't really until I hit, almost my 20s that I realized I could have a job in games. What? Like, how could I have a career in games? Even though I was running these communities and doing all this activity, for me, it was just a hobby. But I was doing some quite high level community management and event management, and that's how I made my break. So, making them more accessible and that's to everybody. And actually, a lot of that is just the breadth of games that are being created now and the accessibility of the tools for games. So looking at things like Unity, for example, it's allowing people who would otherwise not afford to go to uni or couldn't access those tools, or younger people, really young people, to make games much easier. It's great.
I'd say for me, it's well, obviously, like anyone who grew up playing video games in a certain era, I mourn the loss of going around to people's houses with a controller, plugging it into the same console and playing split screen sort of inches from the telly. The ease with which you can just drop into a game with somebody and drop into a voice channel on, voice clients like Discord or Skype or even Zoom or whatever. It's really wonderful. It's made it so much easier to keep in contact with people I don't get to see normally, like friends who have moved away to other cities, or, especially in unprecedented scenarios like this when we can't just meet up. It's really lovely just how straightforward it is now to interact with somebody and get the sense that you are hanging out, because you are occupying a physical space together and you can hear one another, you can influence what's going on. It's oddly comforting, I think.
I've been sitting in like servers on Nintendo's app on my phone with Animal Crossing for like basically weeks now. That's my lock-in jam. And all the women that I'm playing with, it's pretty much all women, my friend group, who are playing it, they would never ever join a Discord. They would never use voice chat, and the accessibility is incredible. It's so nice.
I like that. That's a very sweet place to
Really wholesome.
Yeah, isn't it, to go to? And we've got lots of comments in the chat. Nick Monroe, Jazzy B, all mourning the loss of split screen with you, Johnny. So definitely touched a nerve there. So I guess one of the things that came up then was the idea that we're seeing this kind of greater accessibility to games. We're seeing, a variance in what games are. We're seeing lots more different types of games, lots more different ways you can play them. So one of the things I'm really interested in is kind of the discussion around what is a game, because obviously if you're on kind of a slightly more toxic side of the industry, you are somebody that might not call Candy Crush a game, as you mentioned before, and yet that, to me personally, that's a game. You're absolutely a gamer if you play it. And recently I was on the BAFTA jury for the Games Beyond Entertainment, and we had a big, huge discussion about the game Kind Words, which if anybody hasn't played it, you should have.
It's so good.
Exactly.
So
but that's essentially a game where you have a little room, you go into it, and you send real messages back and forth with other players anonymously. And it is, for most people, a very wholesome experience. It has been life-changing for people. And yet there was a big, huge discussion about whether that should be eligible because, is it a game? So I guess I'm interested to see, in this era where we have got huge variety in what we call a game, what to you makes something a game? What makes it, an experience that fits within the games industry?
I'd probably say that it's just an incentive to keep going. The sort of a phrase that's bandied about a lot of the time is, gamifying, and people talk about gamifying the office environment or whatever, but offering an incentive to carry on. Like Candy Crush, you level up, or you get to access the next level, or you get some form of in-game currency as a reward for completing a level or what have you. In Kind Words, when you send a letter to somebody, you can attach a sticker, and when people reply, they can send you a sticker, and there's kind of a challenge to collect them all. It just so happens that the mechanic to collect all of these stickers is to write letters to people who need help and advice, which is sweet, to be honest. It's nice. I think, to be honest, like working in tabletop games for the past few months, my definition of what can be a game has broadened considerably, because there are so many games where you read that, you're like, really, that's what we're doing with this? Like that's our motive for the next hour? Fine, great. So I definitely feel like there are people out there who are excessively pure in their definition of games, and I think that is counterproductive, because it's in indie games that we see some of the best innovation, and those are the people who actually dare to dream, I think.
For me, I think it's got to entertain you and be in some way interactive. That's kind of, I'm as loose as that. One of my favourite games of the last 5 years is Her Story, which is, it's a search engine game. It's, it's like type in a word, you watch a video, type in a word, but it's interactive, it's entertaining. I think the driving forward is a really interesting angle as well, that, that there's a reason to go forward. But even then, there's some games that are just complete sandpits and are great fun for being that. So I just want to be entertained. And if it's got some sort of interaction, then I call it a game.
Yeah, for me, it's only really interactivity that is the kind of benchmark for me, I guess. Like, I work with indie games almost exclusively now, and the breadth of stuff that we see is just incredible. There's an event in Berlin called Amaze, and every year they curate a showcase. It's from all over the world, so you'll see developers from quite marginalized areas you would never really get access to seeing their games, and the scope of what they can create, because there is no definition, that's the joy of it. I do think it's a shame that people want to label, but it's natural, I think, to kind of be tribal as a human, and that's where it comes from, I think, at its core. But the indie game scene in itself is where the innovation happens, and a lot of the times the bigger game companies, once it's been proven with indie, they'll take the mechanics and use it themselves. You'll see that a lot. That's why Minecraft was massive, and now we're seeing all these kind of Minecraft-esque experiences. Is it Dragon Quest Heroes? Is that the one? Yeah, that's a good example. That wouldn't exist if Minecraft hadn't paved the way.
I do think it's interesting with games, though. There's still some stigma, because if you look at movies, nobody's that fussed about defining whether they're a moviegoer or not.
Yeah,
it's not really. It's not got any kind of cachet or what, or either. And yet, if you say you're a gamer or not a gamer, there's some kind of polarization, and I find that a bit strange, to be honest. But there's this thing which I have said before, and it's actually partly because I'm in BAFTA, which is sort of a joke. And it's this: you've got like movies, film, and games. And for a long time, games were like the awkward second cousin that nobody wanted to bring out at a family party. And then suddenly they made loads of money, and they became like the Beverly Hillbillies, all money and no class. And only in the last sort of 5 years, I think it's probably things like Unity and Unreal democratizing it, where they've actually got some cultural kudos and credibility, and it's a bit more level. And, you know, with the things of seeing some big Hollywood names going into games now, it does feel like it's leveling out. But it has had this kind of weird rise to fame, I think, games, which, and maybe every media goes through that. You know, perhaps music went through that. Maybe films did go through that in the 40s and 50s. But certainly I've always found it slightly odd that, you know, people don't polarize other entertainment media. Oh, you don't like watching television, what? You know, it's like,
Yeah.
I find that, you know, a bit strange.
Part of it's the marketing that preceded it, right? So you know this, in the 80s it was very, very geared towards men and a very specific kind of almost nerdy-esque area of games, and that's why they made this weird pivot into that kind of crazy hypersexualized, hypermasculine route that they went through when it transitioned out of the arcade and into the home. I think that has actually followed it even now. I do feel like there's a lot of baggage that we're carrying because of the way that it was positioned back in the day, and that's where it's come from.
There are still some, like, you can look up some adverts for the Game Boy and the Game Boy Pocket that are weirdly sexualized. Genuinely, it's like, you know, it's a couple in bed lit just by a Game Boy screen, and you think, this is Nintendo, it's the house of Mario. They would never do that, but they absolutely tried to use sex to sell Game Boys back in the day. It's strange.
I have to just point out a really great comment that we've had in the chat, actually, from Roxanne Stockwell, who, Dave, based on your comment that you kind of think interactivity and entertainment is what makes a game, has decided that a pantomime is now a game because interactive and entertaining, which
I love that.
I really love that.
Because there are rules. Everyone knows the rules of a pantomime.
Exactly.
Is something behind someone? What do? Like, does someone say something is? You have a response.
So yeah, thank you, Roxanne. I think that's made my day. So I guess if we're talking kind of the last, you know, we as you said, we've had this big kind of boom in games becoming more mainstream, in, you know, just growing and maturing as a medium, as a genre. So what for you has stood out in the last kind of, let's say, you know, 5-10 years? Which games for you are, you know, really exciting, really pushing forward the medium of games?
For me, I think there's been a number of narrative games that have really pushed the boundaries. So something like Heavy Rain, I think some of the Walking Dead games, you know, and others that have come since then. I think that for a long time, narrative in games was a bit ropey. And I don't mean to, you know, not for anybody's fault, but through production values and the fact that this needed to happen and bug fixing and whatever else. But narrative has really come into its own. And I think the one thing that games can do is put you in the narrative more than any other medium. So, I mean, I love reading and stuff, and it's great to feel like you're the character in the book and whatever, but, you know, quite often it is a third-person experience. And I know we have third-person games, but actually, I think in games you really feel like you're in there. So if you then have that experience layered with a really good story, I think that's incredibly powerful. And that's a big change that will stay with us, and I think is really, really good.
Yeah, I feel like medium itself has matured a lot in terms of the subject matter and people are willing to tackle sensitively and otherwise sometimes. But overall, I feel like as a medium, it's been maturing in a way in the last 5 years that we haven't seen it do so quickly. And a lot of that is down to a lot of writers understanding the value of games and their portfolio, not just writing for TV or books or other places. And we're really benefiting from this migration from other creative fields. That to me is crazy exciting, and that kind of feeds into your narrative point, Dave, where, you know, I feel like because the industry is becoming much more confident and a lot more experienced in terms of delivering these very deep experiences, we're seeing like a real resurgence of games that, you know, the narrative experience slowed down a lot I would say, in the early 2000s, because it was the Wii era. It was very much about make games quick, get them out. There's, family experiences, because that was the Wii kind of area, and people slowed down a lot, and then it became all about how much playtime can we like sandwich into this game. And then you had those very formulaic Ubisoft games. I worked on tons of those. I did like 7 Assassin's Creeds, right? So yeah, I know. And after a while, you feel the kind of bloat, I guess is probably a horrible word to use, but you feel the bloat of those games after a while, with these meaningless kind of tasks. And actually, even Assassin's Creed, you look at the scope of the recent games, they're so polished, and there's so much more geared towards a really beautiful character experience, which they tried to do before, but it was marred by this other development. So the narrative progression and the kind of maturity of what we're seeing now is wonderful.
Definitely narrative is the big one for me, but particularly games as exercises in empathy. A lot of my work in video games has been centered around mental health, and there are some games, like Life is Strange or Hellblade, or indie titles that very directly reference particular mental illnesses or other things, like That Dragon Cancer, which is talking about the loss of a loved one. It's really incredible how powerful these things can be as exercises in putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to portray a lived experience. And I think it really goes back to what you were saying, Dave, about how you feel like you are an agent in it. When you're moving a character around the screen, you have a more direct sense of connection with them, and that can really help put you in the moment and also put you through like a range of emotions and a journey in a very sort of palpable sense. So I think that's been really gratifying, actually. Like, some of the conversations I've had around games in the last 5-10 years are unlike any I'd had prior to that. Before, it was all, it was solely based around the gameplay, like, again, Assassin's Creed games and the bloat on those, even though I loved them. It's like, oh, how far are you? And it's like, oh, I've got this many people left to kill, etc., etc., etc. It's funny.
Yeah, I've got another eavesdropping mission that will require me to follow someone for like 10 minutes with my hand lightly up.
Insta-fail stealth sections.
Yeah, honestly. Well, I think for me, definitely, I would agree with the narrative. I think one of the things I found really exciting, and you kind of touched on this, Korina, is the idea that we're seeing these big AAA games start to adopt things from smaller games and just care more about narrative, care more. For me, one of my favorite games of all time has to be the recent God of War reboot. And for me, that was the level of detail, the level of care in the narrative, and the kind of, it sounds ridiculous to say experience, but, games, I feel like for a long time, games were very much about what the studio wanted you to feel, not about you having an experience within that game that might, change depending on who you are as a person and how you play and, and how you react to those different things. And I think one of the things I really felt about God of War is that everybody I've spoken to who played it had a really different personal experience with it, which I thought was really interesting for a big AAA game, which, for a long time, they were very samey, they felt very, very similar in how they were kind of pumped out, I'm going to say. And so I think one of the things I'm really interested is what do you think is our next generation? What's going to define our next generation of games? Because I think it's fair to say each one so far has really had a kind of big theme or ethos, or, you look back and you can really feel what that generation meant to gaming. So as we kind of approach, new Xbox, new PS5, that's always the big marker of a new generation. So what do you think we're looking forward to, and what do you hope to see?
I think one of the things I'm not saying this is actually that exciting, but I think streaming of games is going to be really important, because it's happened with music, then it happened with film and TV, and now it's going to happen with games. And that pattern actually, I mean, this is a bit commercial thinking, but we're very fortunate in games that we see 2 other industries mess it up first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we can learn from all their mistakes and get it right. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how streaming democratizes play and makes it easier for more people to play games. And I think it might break down some of the barriers around the exclusivities and so that I think will be interesting. I mean, if you buy a DVD, not that you do these days, from Sony, right? Sony, like a Spider-Man Sony movie, it doesn't only work on Sony DVD players, right? So why do we have this? Now, I'm sure it's there certainly for a reason to sell those boxes. But that's going to change at some point, I think. And the commercial things around making a big game. You talk about, I mean, God of War, amazing game, you know, but it will have actually done probably 4 or 5 million units because it's only on one console, which is crazy, you know. Whereas a multi-platform game of the same level must do 20 million units or 30 million, you know. So I think that will have to change, and it will democratize the boxes that you have under the TV and that sort of thing. So I think that's something that's very interesting. But and then from a more experiential perspective, I think it will be about how we actually interact. So I mean, you know, I think what we can do with mobiles now is amazing. We're looking at games that use facial tracking, for example, touch, voice, all these things, which will make it incredibly natural to interact with these games. Very different to, like I said before, the sort of button bashing of 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like you're talking about those kind of digital distribution models. You know, we've seen in games, like certainly things like Atomic are currently running, that, you know, they're not huge, they're very focused on indies, but they've had success with that. So we've started to see the model of how this can work. And certainly with the new consoles that are coming out, I think the interesting thing for me, kind of riffing off that, is looking at the subscription models that are involved, and what that offering is. And I really think the offering of those subscription models paired with the potentials of streaming games themselves, not necessarily downloading, you know, obviously there's a limitation with that. If you live in a territory with poor internet, for example, or bad access, it does limit your access to that, and that is a shame. That's a reality of the world, unfortunately. But I do think that may be the thing that will set one console above the other eventually. Yeah.
I think it's less of a prediction and more of a hope that the next console generation, as essentially consoles move closer to just being PCs in a particular bit of plastic cladding, with the customization options that are on offer, I really hope that we see them becoming more easily accessible for disabled people. There was an interesting article that went up this week about how the Nintendo Switch is amazing for disabled people over other consoles, because, you know, detachable controllers, they're very, you know, small forms, and of course, you know, there are charities like Special Effect which go into people's homes and help them get, you know, playing games again. I forgot the name of the Xbox controller that is infinitely customizable, the one with the 2 big buttons.
The modular one. Oh, I've forgotten too. Oh no.
But it's, you know, it's been rightly lauded for being really useful for getting people who otherwise can't play in games. And I really hope, as basically, you know, as Dave sort of alluded to, we sort of start seeing not homogenization, but, you know, consoles sort of moving toward a similar plateau. That means that it's easier to improve accessibility options. There's been sort of some ground made in that, for example, you know, like colorblind options becoming more standardized in options menus and stuff like that. Adaptive controller, says Tom D in the chat. Thank you so much, Tom. You saved me from a lifetime of embarrassment. But anyway, that is my hope, basically, is that as games become more widely played and more accessible, they become truly accessible as physical objects.
Accessibility is so interesting because we saw a bit of it with Kinect, what they tried to do, right, with using the things that weren't dependent on voice or input controls. That was kind of cool, although creepy because obviously the Kinect. But I hated it. Yeah. But I really did. I used to think that my sofa was a human, so it wasn't perfect, bless it. But like, you know, you're looking at things like voice controls, for example. They've progressed in the last like 5 years beyond anything anyone can imagine. You know, I remember working on End War, Tom Clancy games. Remember that? Oh yeah.
I was just thinking about that.
There you go. There's a throwback for you. And you know, it couldn't understand anyone who didn't sound like you know, Tom Hanks or you know, someone with a really, really thick American accent or a really thick English accent. Like, you know, it was awful. And it was a real issue. But at the time, they really tried to do something special with that. Thank God you could play it with button input, right? But you know, seeing the difference between something like that and what we have now with Siri on your phone or Alexa, it's amazing. And I hope that that accessibility becomes more ingrained with the consoles going forward.
I think it also creates new game experiences, you know. So I mean, one of my dreams, I don't know whether I'll get this, is to make a game like Her Story in VR where I'm interviewing that person. You know, that's like my ultimate or for somebody to make it for me, and me for just to play it out.
I was going to say, you shouldn't have said this on video. Copyright.
Well, look, these ideas are easy. It's execution that's hard, isn't it? But I think that would be an amazing experience to actually be interviewing somebody and feeling, getting different responses depending on how you ask the question, what questions you ask, and so on. I think that's something that those experiences will come in the next 5 years. I think it's doable now. To be honest, there are certain bit of smoke and mirrors that you could probably do to make it happen, and that's a completely different game to a Halo or whatever. Totally new experiences. So those things I'm really looking forward to.
Well, we are pretty much out of time, which is heartbreaking because I've enjoyed this so much. So I thought I would finish up on now this is the dreaded question, and I'm not going to call it what's your favourite game, but I'm going to call it very quickly, kind of, in a couple of sentences, tell us and, the audience watching, I guess, about a game you just wish people knew about. It could be something, underrated. It could be something everybody knows, but you just love for a particular reason. So, tell us about a game in your personal history of games that you love. I'm going to give everyone a second. Yeah.
Shall I start? Because I've got props, so I'm going to use them.
Yeah,
yes, please.
I know.
Yes, please.
There's a game called Shining in the Darkness. Oh, look, there's my collection. Wait.
Oh, my goodness.
Some people might remember this is a Mega Drive game. I'm going to give you a modern alternative. So, Shining in the Darkness, this game is so hard. It's crazy. There's no maps in game. So, essentially, if anyone's played The Legend of Grimrock, which is a brilliant game. Now, that game, you can get it on Steam now. Discounted for ludicrous price. It's brilliant. That's the modern equivalent of this, essentially, is where they got it from. So this game, you don't get any maps. You have to basically remember the entire dungeon yourself. So as a kid, I would draw the maps every time I played, and there's no save. So I'd have to go through the entire map every single time. This game's amazing. Grimrock's not quite as horribly difficult as that, but Legend of Grimrock, if you want something that's a real challenge and really unusual, totally play that. It's brilliant. There you go. That's my contribution.
Strong opening choice, yeah.
I'm going to pick one, and it's sad to say I don't think you can get hold of it anymore because it was a sort of fairly early mobile game called Ranyard, and it was just a puzzle game where you had to get the trains from where they started into the housings, and trains were different colours, and you put in the track to make it happen. And it basically ruined Christmas for my family. I had a great time. I was so addicted to it. I would literally I won't be a minute, and I'd just go and have another game and then come back into the sort of family Christmas dinner because it was so good. And you can't get it because it's, as you were talking about earlier, John, it's, because of the nature of the digital nature of games, they're not preserved. So that's the one I'm going to pick.
I always choke on this question because my short-term memory just goes, or my long-term memory rather. So there are lots of things that have meant a lot to me sort of over my time, but really I love anything that acts as sort of like a story engine, stuff where emergent stuff just happens and you end up sort of having water cooler moments where you're like, you won't believe this thing that happened in this game last night. And for me at the minute, that is absolutely Sea of Thieves. I've been playing it solidly for 2 years. And it's a game where you're pirates, you go dig up treasure, you go fight skeletons, you go take their skulls and turn them in. But it's just the stuff that happens in between that is incredible. You'll start spinning stories that'll take 10 minutes to tell about how some other players turned up and they got on board your ship and tried to sink you by pouring buckets of seawater in, but then you realise and hid on their ship and then blew it up, blah, 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 blah. It's a beautiful hot mess. And that for me is the most exciting thing. If it gets me telling a story, then that's what I really love. So play Sea of Thieves before it goes away eventually. Because
if everyone plays it, then we can keep it around forever.
Well, exactly. There we go. It's really a crusade for me. It's just, please keep my favourite game alive.
Well, I think mine, if I had to pick, would probably be, again, I don't like the favourite game question, but I think probably Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which was kind of, for anybody who hasn't played it, a narrative experience. People call it a walking simulator, which I don't love, but for me, I'm a big FPS player, so I'm like a really cliche gamer. I love Call of Duty. I love anything where I can have a gun, and so playing something like that ostensibly falls into that area of what is a game, because you are kind of walking around uncovering a story with very little kind of interaction from yourself other than kind of physically moving yourself around this village, uncovering the story of where everybody's gone. And it was just magnificent, an absolute masterpiece in every way, absolutely stunning, incredible story, absolutely unbelievable voice acting. You know, one of the things I loved was seeing the work the Chinese room did afterwards to kind of explain all their methods, because they felt like, you know, they'd kind of elevate, I mean, this sounds big-headed and they didn't say this, but they felt like they'd elevated standards in, you know, kind of voice acting and narrative design, and so they really went out of their way to share that information, which I loved, because they were not about saying we're the best, but about saying, you know, let's all do better. So for me, that's a game that really kind of changed my perspective on games and what I could enjoy doing in games, and what I needed to get from games, which I thought was like kind of fast-paced, you know, action, but actually what I love is just wandering around an English countryside village solving a mystery. So basically I'm Miss Marple, that's what I'm saying.
Living the dream. Yeah,
exactly.
Iconic.
But yeah, so that's basically all we've got time for. So thank you so much. Like I said, this was so interesting. It was absolutely fantastic to have you all here. As I said, wonderful mix of backgrounds that kind of, you know, really helped highlight different sections of the chat, bring all the different experiences in. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone in chat, because you were really great in chat. We had some lovely comments. We just had Miss Marple the game, which, I mean, is that real? Sorry, can I just let me know?
There's a Murder, She Wrote board game. It's terrible. Don't play it.
Whoa. Oh.
Yeah, no, seriously. Everyone.
Why would you even tell me?
Sorry, everyone is playing as Angela Lansbury, just a different version. And the best way to score points is to be the last one to go investigate a scene.
What?
So it's the worst instance of Angela Lansbury wins.
I really like that, though. That's kind of funny. The laziest Lansbury.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, as I said, thank you so much to chat, and thank you all for joining. And yeah, that's it for our H Club panel on the history of games. Thank you all very much.